Welcome to our In Focus topic on Black History Month. We'd like to kick off our coverage tonight with how the celebration originated. ABC's Nightline anchor Byron Pitts explains who founded the now federally recognized month and why it occurs in February.
February means it's officially Black History Month, a federally recognized celebration that gives every American a chance to reflect on how African American achievements have contributed to U.S. history and how African accomplishments have impacted the world. But what's the history of Black History Month? It all started with this man, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, known as the father of Black history. In the early 20th century, while earning a master's degree from the University of Chicago and a PhD from Harvard, Woodson grew increasingly frustrated with racist representation and the exclusion of African Americans in books and conversations that shaped history. So in 1915, he joined forces to establish the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, which is now known as the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Led by Woodson in 1916, the organization launched the Journal of Negro History, which published African American history and honored the achievements of people with African descent. In 1926, on the second week of February, Woodson and the ASNLH organization launched Negro History Week to promote the study of Black history in universities, schools, and the Black community. So why February? Their group originally chose the second week of February to include the birthdays of Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery to become an abolitionist and civil rights leader, and Abraham Lincoln, who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The growing awareness highlighted achievements in race pride within the Black community and gave all Americans a new understanding of Black culture. And during the Civil Rights Movement, civil rights workers opened freedom schools in the South, which embraced the week to celebrate the message, among other things. As Black Studies programs spread the movement to universities and campuses across the nation, the week transformed into Black History Month. In 1976, President Gerald Ford officially declared February Black History Month, urging Americans to seize the opportunity to honor the too often neglected accomplishments of Black Americans in every area of endeavor throughout our history. And the rest, as they say, is history.
But it gives us an opportunity that we can reflect on all of the accomplishments that we've made throughout history. Progress wasn't just made by the African Americans. It was made because we had the help of all different diverse groups.
That was Janetta Williams, president of the NAACP Salt Lake branch, back in February 2013, talking about the history of African Americans and the progress that has been made over the last 100 years. Welcome to our In Focus discussion. Every year during the month of February, the U.S. celebrates Black History Month, which encompasses a vast spectrum of incredible stories, figures, accomplishments, events, and more in American history. But it's also a time for the country to reflect on the painful events of the past and address the inequality, discrimination, and systemic issues that still exist today. Our conversation tonight is meant to be insightful, informative, and maybe even uncomfortable. Joining us now live in studio is Meligha Garfield, director of the Black Cultural Center at the University of Utah, and via Zoom, Adrienne Andrews, chief diversity officer at Weber State University. Meligha and Adrienne, thank you both for being here tonight for our discussion. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having us.
It's a delight to be here.
Adrienne, let's start with you. What does Black History Month mean to you, and how do you like to celebrate it?
Well, Black History Month for me is an opportunity to celebrate who I am and the heritage I come from, both what is known and unknown. And it's a very exciting time for me, but it's also a sad time. It's sad because everything gets pushed into the month of February. And in this 28-day month, we are supposed to learn everything we need to know about Black history instead of understanding how it's integrated throughout all history, in particular in this country, American history. But I like to celebrate it by reading books, having conversations with friends, connecting with family and my community, which is of course hard to do during COVID, but we're doing it right now. And I like to be educated about Black history because I certainly don't know everything there is to know. And so I'm delighted to have Meligha here with me. I'm sure he'll impart some really fantastic knowledge for all of us.
Meligha, let's get your input on this. How do you like to celebrate Black History Month, and what does it mean to you?
I love the aspect of Black History Month, more so kind of highlighting those that may not necessarily be highlighted throughout history. We usually talk about Martin Luther King Jr. or Rosa Parks, but never really like Marcus Garvey or Audre Lorde or various other members in our community that have made strides throughout our country from before the history of this country and its founding until now. And so I like to spend this month to really kind of talk about those hidden treasures, I would say, of Black history.
Meligha, when Black stories are included in U.S. history textbooks and classrooms, what kind of stories are being told?
Yes, as of right now, history kind of excludes Black History Month. We usually talk about just slavery or the civil rights movement, so it's like 2 periods in time that we only talk about, when Black history is a part of American history, and we've been here since before the nation's founding. And actually in Latin America, we've been here since the 1500s. So really there's like a rich history in that, and is not often taught.
Now, Meligha, Black history is much more than slavery and Martin Luther King Jr., although they are 2 very important parts, but sometimes that's all we talk about. In your opinion, what other topics need to be included when an educator or a parent talks to their students and children about Black history?
Yes. I would say Black feminist thought, theory on Malcolm X or W. Du Bois, things such as the abolitionist movement with, sorry.
It's okay, we forgive you for that.
My bad. But such as the abolitionist movements of the late 1800s with Frederick Douglass and other people that are by their side. And as far as throughout history, really just talking about various things, rather that be police brutality, rather that be redlining that is happening in various neighborhoods, that is throughout the early 1900s, and various other aspects as well.
Adrienne, I'd like to talk about the psychology behind excluding painful parts of Black history from U.S. history, which are the same thing. There's dark and shameful events that get left out and don't get talked about or discussed. Is this dangerous to do so, and can we make progress if we don't address the past?
I really love this question, Rosie, and the reason is because it is dangerous if we don't have these conversations about the dark and shameful events of our history. And if we don't talk about them, then we can't be sure never to repeat them. And that means we have to be willing to look at what has happened in the past, what led to those decisions and actions, and how we want to be different today, and what we're doing to address the harms, the continuous harms that come from those past. Meligha mentioned redlining, and a lot of people might not have heard that term before. Redlining was a way to segregate housing, in particular for Black and brown people, away from people who identified as white. And the homes that they were able to purchase or rent and live in tended to be in neighborhoods or communities where there were less resources, less support systems, and just simply a harder sort of capacity or environment to live in. So if that's the environment you grow up in, then you're going to have a lack of certain resources or experiences, which puts you behind as you move forward in life. And so if we fail to discuss something like redlining that fundamentally transforms how people live today, then we fail to acknowledge that it doesn't matter how hard you may have worked, or your grandparents may have worked, or their grandparents may have worked. Instead, you're still dealing with the residual impacts in history of redlining that kept you out of the opportunities that could help you where you would be today. And so when we talk about privilege, one of the things we're talking about is redlining.
All right, hold that thought. We're just touching the tip of the surface. We have to take a quick commercial break, but we'll be right back.
Well, here in Utah, it's more hidden. It's more under the surface. It's more like people have their heads stuck in the sand and don't want to talk about the issue.
That was Reverend Davis of Calvary Baptist Church talking to ABC4 News back in February 2019 about how he believes our state needs to undergo serious changes in its foundational makeup before it can change the culture on issues of minority oppression. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on Black History Month. Before the break, we were joined by Meligha Garfield, director of the Black Cultural Center at the University of Utah, and Adrienne Andrews, chief diversity officer at Weber State University. We pick up right where we left off. Meligha, what is one particularly significant event or story in Black history that's not known to many people that you think we should know about?
Yes, I really think as far as so I have a background in colonial Latin American history, and the really big aspect of that is understanding that when slaves were brought over to the United States, only 10% of that population actually were brought to the colonies. The other 90% of Africans that were brought in slavery were to various Latin American countries. And the fact that I like to always kind of throw out there is that in Brazil, there are more African Americans, as we say, or Black people in Brazil than there are in the United States. And so really just kind of that aspect of Blackness kind of transcends just the United States, but all of the Americas that are here in this Western Hemisphere.
Adrienne, let's hear from you. What do you think is something, a story or an event that's not often talked about that we need to know?
Well, I love that Meligha shared truly historical component moving back in time and looking at the Black diaspora in this hemisphere. I want us to be talking about something happening more recently. That would be ending slavery in Utah with the fight for Amendment C with our own legislature, ending slavery in our Constitution. People like to think Black history is a long time ago, but what we realize is Black history is still happening today and every day. And the fact that Utah still had slavery in its constitution, in its state constitution, means that as a state, we had not been ready to address the wrongs of the past. And as the Reverend Dr. Franz Davis was indicating in his message, we like to keep our head in the sand about it. And we simply can't do that any longer. And with representatives like Sandra Hollins and others, we don't have to, because we're willing to speak truth to power, become educated about the issues, and transform the law where it has excluded or harmed us.
Adrienne, when it comes to Black figures, some people often think of and celebrate an athlete, entertainer, or musician. But when it comes to other professions, we're talking about scientists, attorneys, doctors, CEOs. There are still stigmas, challenges, barriers that exist for Black people pursuing these careers. Why is that, and how do we change it?
So Rosie, representation matters. It's really hard to believe that you can be something when you never see anyone who looks like you in those roles. That's why today, as I look at our United States Vice President, Kamala Harris, I think anything for me is possible. What my parents told me as a child is true. I could now aspire to that. And in fact, for young people today and the generations to come, they'll have never lived in a time where a Black woman or a biracial woman or multiracial woman hadn't been in that leadership role. And so when we are talking about cultivating leadership and opportunities, when we expand the possibilities for all audiences, it improves outcomes for all of us substantially. And so while I think that there are still stigmas and challenges and barriers, what we can choose to do, if we're willing to do it, is to seek out those who've been excluded and invite not only to the table, to be engaged individuals at the table and decision makers with what happens next. I think that that is something we've got to do. And it starts with our young people, as young as preschool, as well as to our seniors in our community who have seen the history, have lived through it, and can recognize that equity means inclusion.
All right, about a minute left before we have to go to commercial break. Adrienne, I'm going to give this last question in this segment to you. What is the significance of having Black History Month in a year after a year like 2020, when the country had such a racial reckoning?
Well, I think for me, the magic is, are we who we say we are? After the divisive year that was 2020, after seeing death, violence, destruction, hostility, and aggression, people said that that is not what they wanted anymore. So are we willing to show up, become educated and engaged, and transform into the people that we believe we are as folks here in the United States of America? That's why it matters today.
All right, Meligha and Adrienne, hold that thought. We have to take another commercial break. But when we return, we'll resume our In Focus discussion on Black History Month.
There's abundance of data showing that people of color often receive lower quality care. As an example, Black infants are 3 times more likely to die if cared by a white physician.
That was Dr. Paloma Cariello of University of Utah Health back in January, talking about how she believes racism is a public health crisis. The university says their first step was to acknowledge racism is a problem in healthcare, then to structure their work around conscious actions to enact change. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on Black History Month. Before the break, we were joined by Meligha Garfield, director of the Black Cultural Center at the University of Utah, and Adrienne Andrews, chief diversity officer at Weber State University. We pick up right where we left off. Adrienne, let's talk about COVID-19. The pandemic is disproportionately impacting communities of color. Now that there is a vaccine, there is some resistance from the Black community to take it, and this is because of history. Where did that mistrust come from?
Well, if you look at our history of healthcare for Black people in this country, you can just go back a few decades and look at the Tuskegee Experiment, where the federal government came into a community and did testing on Black individuals without their knowledge, giving them syphilis, not treating them for it, allowing them to spread it to their wives and partners, as well as their children and others. This was not an experiment done with people's knowledge, with engagement. And in fact, because of what happened with that experiment, truly experimenting on Black people, we have a whole set of protocols that are now different for how we do research and how we come to an understanding of whether or not something is ethically correct to do. And so when you take an experience like that, when you take experiences of Black women being sterilized and not being allowed to have their own reproductive choices, when you have that history behind you, a new vaccine is very scary. And I understand that as a board member of the McCady and Layton Hospital boards for Intermountain. I very much work hard to educate our community members along with our system about what the care is behind this vaccine, what its efficacy rates are, and why it's safe to take. But we have to be honest by owning the past, admitting where we were wrong, and committing ourselves not only to doing better, but to actually being better.
Now, Meligha, earlier this month, Maria Montessori Academy, which is a North Ogden charter school, made national headlines for allowing parents to opt their children out of Black History Month events on campus. How did you feel, or what did you think when you heard about this news?
I felt troubled. I was just like, wow, how can you opt out of Black history when Black history is part of American history? Again, as I was stating earlier, Black history and Black people, contributions to this country have been here before even the country's founding. So how do you opt out of that? It's like saying, hey, I'm gonna opt out of the Civil War because, you know, I just don't really feel like it. And that's part of American history. And I just find it kind of troubling in that statement. And I know that it was retracted, but just kind of troubling.
Let's look into the future. Meligha, with the new administration only being in office for 3 weeks, it is very early to tell how the next 4 years are going to go, but President Biden is making racial justice one of his 4 operating principles. What do you hope to see come from his first term?
Yes, definitely more prison reform as far as across this country. We've already had a bill that has already came out, or an executive order come out as far as abolishing some privatized prisons, but just really more prison reform across the country, as well as decriminalization of marijuana, because such a large population of African Americans have been subjected to being casted into prison because of small drug and minor drug offenses. So definitely decriminalization of marijuana. I would say as far as and this kind of affects all of us, but student loans forgiveness, definitely making sure that we can uplift the next class of African Americans, as well as just Americans across this country that are trying to enter the workforce, also buy houses in this day and age. They need money, and with that, alleviating some of that stress with student loans can definitely help us.
Adrienne, we have about a minute left. I'm going to give the last question to you. There's some mixed feelings from the Black community about whether there should be a Black History Month. Now, the arguments are understandable. Black history is U.S. history, so why should they be separated? Or Black history shouldn't be reduced down to just 1 month of the year, which you did talk about. What do you think? Should there be a Black History Month?
We need a Black History Month because we're not doing an adequate job of integrating Black history throughout American history. And so in that sense, we'll need it until we do better. And we know better. The difference is there seems to be a true tension on whether or not people are willing to put that energy, time, and investment into educating themselves and really expanding the curriculum to paint the fuller picture of the people in this country and our cultures. And to that end, you asked a question about the future, and looking to the future as relates to this issue in particular is using an equity lens or framework so that we can review not only curriculum, but policies, procedures, and protocols to determine, are people being harmed intentionally or unintentionally, and how can we self-correct for that? I love that our Utah Board of Higher Education has adopted an equity lens, and that's at a state level and really speaks to me. And additionally, at my own institution, Weber State University, where we are using an equity framework to frame our entire university planning document moving forward. And using an equity framework doesn't just improve things for Black or brown people, it improves things for all of us, for women, for men, for people who may or may not have disabilities, and on and on and on as we look at the diversity that we so beautifully reflect in this state.
All right, you've been hearing from Meligha Garfield, Director of the Black Cultural Center at the University of Utah, and Adrienne Andrews, Chief Diversity Officer at Weber State University. Thank you both for such an insightful discussion. We appreciate your time.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.